joining me here today, Gideon.
Of course, it's a pleasure to join you.
And you're writing on Substack. You have a publication called Futurepolis. Could you explain to listeners a bit about your thoughts about starting your own Substack and what your experience have been with it so far?
Yes, of course. So I started the Substack to write about the future of democracy, which is a very broad topic. But over my last few years as a journalist working in different places, I became interested in the ways that people are thinking about what it would look like if we were reinventing democracy today in the 21st century, how it would be different from the institutions that were created centuries ago. And I found it difficult to find ways to tell these stories in mainstream media. Particularly as an editor, I was having trouble finding journalists who were interested in this stuff and also stories that were compelling. And I realized that I wanted to understand the field better myself because I think there are a very wide array of people who are working on different facets of this problem. And I wanted to map it out for myself and find stories to write. And it seemed like doing a Substack, doing a newsletter just on my own would mean that I could basically write freely, meaning not have an editor tell me what they thought was interesting and what wasn't interesting, but just be my own boss. Explore the themes I was interested in, write at whatever pace I would like, and yeah, just use it as a method of exploring this subject area without necessarily having a pressure about how much audience to have or what deadlines to fill or trying to generate revenue about it. So my experience of doing it so far is that, yes, I have that freedom. Building an audience is hard. It takes time. The kind of stuff that I'm writing about is not the stuff that makes the big news. I'm often writing about things that are very much in the background. They're small scale projects and experiments. They take time to bear fruit. And so my audience is quite small. It's mostly, I think, focused around people who are themselves working in this future of democracy space. They're not the broader public that I might want to reach. And so those are problems I'm going to have to solve. And also, how do I make money off of this is another problem I'm going to have to solve. It's
Hmm.
not clear even that making money is the goal. It's more about using it as a space to explore the ideas and then figuring out what are ways to earn a living related to that. But just from the newsletter itself, maybe that's not how I earn a living.
Hmm. And the future of democracy,
Mm.
what does that concept cover more in detail?
Mm. So the way I think of it is that if you were to design democratic governance today, some things that you might do differently are you might find ways for people to participate in decision making or in input into legislation that are not just elections every few years. We have the technology now and we have the capabilities to give people a voice and not do it simply through a vote, but canvass opinions, have debates online, find consensus in various ways. And so I think there are all sorts of forms of deliberative or participatory democracy that are being tried at small scales in many different places. And I think there are interesting questions about how easy, how possible it is, yes, how plausible it would be to scale those ideas, to use them in a broader way or for a wider range of decision making. So that's one, but that is just one small facet of the stuff I'm interested in. I think if you're thinking about what it looks like to govern in the 21st century, you also have to think about how do you regulate the technology sector, because government now relies on private sector technology for pretty much all of its infrastructure, right? The cloud services, the cybersecurity work, the algorithms for decision making. So much of that is created by the private sector, and government relies on it. So the question of how you regulate that technology and those companies is at the forefront. I think similarly, problems of how you make government itself run better using technology are really crucial. How government acquires technology, for instance, the way if you want to build a website to provide a government service, who are the contractors that do that? What are the ways in which you specify the requirements for those contractors? How do you translate laws, which are kind of general and high level, into technical requirements? All of those are things government is not very good at. And so How do you improve that? That is another part of this problem. How do you make digital services to citizens better, more effective, more like what they're used to seeing from private companies? In other words, how do you get more of government services online and make them something citizens can use? How do you improve trust in institutions? What role does the media play in a society where people can get their information from many more sources? How should social media be constructed? Are there ways to build social media that don't reward polarization and extreme views online, but create a better, more consensus-based civic dialogue? What do laws of freedom of speech even mean? What should they mean? When free speech laws were created, the problem was that speech was expensive. In other words, if you wanted to really disseminate your ideas, you needed a printing press or other things like that. And speech was easy to suppress. And today we have the opposite problem. Speech is very cheap, it's very widespread. And so the ideas that free speech laws were supposed to help promote, the free spread of ideas, is in fact the obstacle to the free spread of ideas is not that it's hard to disseminate them, but that they're drowned out by a lot of noise and a lot of misinformation. How do you deal with the problem of misinformation itself? How do you combat it? All of these are like different aspects of the problem of how you govern in the 21st century. And what I'm trying to do is write about the work that people are doing in those areas, tie connections between them, create more of a sense that there is, in fact, a kind of movement, an emerging movement of people who are thinking about this problem. And, much in the way that we have a climate change movement or a climate change industry that is composed of people working on many different facets of the problem. So I think there is an emerging democracy governance industry, but it's still much more piecemeal than it could be, and that's what I want to try to highlight in the newsletter.
And the journalism specifically and the media specifically, how do you see their role in the democracy in 2025?
Yeah, I mean, my views on this are probably more developed for the US media than they are for other countries, but I'll start by talking about the US media and maybe kind of try and go broader. I think that in the US in particular, the media saw its role as, or sees its role still as a watchdog, right? So uh, bad things happen. There's corruption, there's mismanagement, problems in the way, and problems in society, problems in the way that government functions. Journalists uncover those, they write about them. Their reporting creates public pressure for change. That public pressure translates into pressure on politicians. Politicians make changes because of that pressure. And so the media plays that accountability role. And I think that the linkages for that accountability have been breaking down in the last few years. So first, because the media no longer has as much of a monopoly on the stories as it used to. And so people are seeing many different versions or many different stories about what's going on. They don't have the same trust in the traditional media institutions. Second, because frankly, it's become easier for politicians to ignore what is going on in the media, both because they can spread their messages through other means. They can use social media. They don't rely on the newspapers to get their voices out there. And because politicians like Donald Trump have just normalized lying and lack of accountability and mistrust in institutions. And so that role that the media has of amplifying a story, creating public pressure, and leading to change, it just doesn't work in the same way that it used to. And I think that journalists in America in particular have to get used to this notion that the whole theory of change behind what they do doesn't work as well. I also think that journalism, and this is true not just in the US, I think that journalism that is constantly focusing on all the things that are going wrong has a disempowering effect on its audiences. You just see this constant stream of bad news. You feel like there's nothing you can do about it. You don't have any influence on institutions. And so it has kind of, instead of empowering the public and creating momentum for positive change, it actually almost has the opposite effect. So I think that journalists should be thinking more about, all right, if I'm writing about a problem, I should also write about what the solutions are to the problem. How might we make change happen? What is the role that citizens could play in that change? And a lot of traditional media organizations see that as problematic because that starts to look like civic advocacy. Um, but I actually think that we need to challenge that perception. We need to re-examine that role and think about what is the media fundamentally for? I think it's for helping make society function better. I think it's for ensuring democracy. I think it's for ensuring openness. And it needs to kind of go back to basics about asking, how do we achieve those goals?
And
I think,
yeah,
sorry, again.
traditionally the media's role has been to be kind of like the public's watchdog and
Mm,
keep an eye out for the people in power. It
yes.
seems to me like the media has failed a bit
Mm,
when we look at some of the powerful politicians again. It's not that the journalists or that the publications themselves has failed. It's more maybe like a systemic failure.
mm,
Um, for instance, leading up to the U.S. elections, I read a lot of news about Trump is terrible, Kamala Harris is going to win.
mm,
And it was a bit of a shock to me to see that there was another side of the coin. And I read a lot about this theory, but
mm,
actually to have that experience to see that I was only seeing one part of the echo chamber.
mm,
Some of my friends, they have read, the polar opposite cycle of the
mm,
news. Um, and this is very strange.
mm,
Also with Elon Musk, for instance, there's so
mm,
much talk about, all the bad things he do.
mm,
And yet he keeps on, earning more money and getting more powerful somehow.
mm.
Uh, do you know? Can you understand how that is possible? That phenomenon.
I think a couple of things. I think the traditional media, a criticism that is made of the traditional media in the US is that it's too dominated by people on the left. This is a criticism that is made on the right. The media has a left-wing bias. I actually think that's true. I think that, we journalists, and I include myself in this, we journalists in the traditional media think that we're being rational and fair and objective, but our values tend to align more with the left than they do with the right. There is something about the whole media ecosystem that has tended to attract people with more progressive views than with more conservative views. And so we lost sight of the fact that we were not actually responding to the interests and the concerns of a more conservative audience. Meanwhile, independent podcasters, YouTubers, other kinds of online influencers were capturing that audience and doing it
Hmm.
very effectively and telling its stories and narratives that corresponded to its concerns and its prejudices. And I think the mainstream media, as well as, for instance, the Democratic Party in the US, just didn't understand the power of that conservative media ecosystem. And there has not been a corresponding progressive left-wing media ecosystem for various reasons, but it's proven easier, I think, for the people on the right to build that kind of network of independent voices. So I think that is one of the reasons that you're seeing what you've seen is that, the as you say, the stories that people are hearing, the opinions that they're hearing have been separated out into these two camps, and those two audiences are being served by completely different outlets. They're seeing different realities, and they're not speaking to one another. Um, I also think that it's a common saying among people on the left in America that the reason people voted for Trump is that they don't believe in democracy anymore. And I don't think that's entirely true. I mean, maybe it's true to an extent. But I actually think that what is going on is that people on the left became so convinced that what they were defending was democracy that they lost sight of the fact that actually, in many ways, America is not very democratic. What we call a democracy here falls short of that ideal in many ways. And I think this is true, again, around the world, around the democratic countries. Democracy still functions along the lines of these institutions created centuries ago. It doesn't give people as much of a voice as they would want, or they feel like the voice that they do have through elections isn't really effective. They don't really see the connection between what they're voting for and what politicians do. Voting is a very blunt instrument. It gives you a choice between two or three options, but it doesn't really let you have a say in the policies that you care about, whether that's immigration, or whether it's LGBTQ rights, or whether it's the economy, unemployment, inflation, whatever it is, it's not responding to what people's actual needs are. And so I think I think Trump voters, and you could say this of conservative voters in Europe as well, and all the people who are supporting the far right parties, I think they simply felt like the democratic system wasn't actually meeting their needs, and it wasn't answering some of their main problems, and it was dominated by elites who held views that were different from theirs, more progressive views. And so they said, what sort of democracy is this? What worth is there in defending this? And so they voted for somebody who was all about tearing it up and throwing it away. I think you mentioned Elon Musk. I think the way that I understand what Musk is doing is that I think he enjoys trolling, and I think he enjoys kicking up a controversy. B, I think that it is probably helpful to his business interests to disrupt these mainstream parties in various countries. He has business interests in many countries, and he can push against regulation, for instance, that's being proposed in these different countries by weakening their governments. I think that his appointment to this Department of Government Efficiency in the US is not really about government efficiency. It's about making things easier for him and other billionaires and their kinds of companies. But the fact that he is able to do this because he has a lot of money, because he has a huge social media platform, all of these are phenomena that were not possible a few decades ago. And so that also explains, I think, the power that somebody like him has.
And how should the media deal with Donald Trump and Elon Musk, for instance, to use those as examples? One
Mm,
thing I have been thinking about is that Elon Musk and Donald Trump, for instance, they have also managed to use the media to their advantage. They have
mm,
managed, every time they make a statement, there's like a huge press coverage of everything they say and do. So
mm.
people are hearing about these people all the time. So it's
Yes,
like they have the media in their hands
right.
somewhat. And the same with social media, everyone is
Mm,
talking about them all the time. How should we deal again with not these people personally, but more with this phenomenon of
mm.
like their power?
Yeah. I think that, yes, definitely someone like Trump is very good at manipulating the media because he knows the media will respond to outrage. And I think the media has gotten better at not playing into his hands as much. Right at the beginning, when he was first running for president, and then right after he was elected, there was this attitude that, everything he says is news, and we have to report on the news. And that meant that we kept on falling into the trap of responding to every single outrage. And by doing so, we were actually amplifying his message and helping him reach the people the people he wanted to reach. So I think we've gotten a little better at not being triggered by every single thing he says, but we probably still do it too much. And unfortunately, part of the reason the media does this is that it is reliant on clicks. It is reliant on audiences coming to see the stories. And so those outrage stories, they play well, they gain readers. And so we're kind of trapped a little bit in a problem of our own making because that's the way our business models work. What can we do better? So I think some of it is not responding to every crazy thing that a Trump or a Musk says. Um, Another is, focusing more stories on what the government's actual policies are, or, in Elon Musk's case, for instance, what his business interests are. Like when he attacked the UK government, when he attacked the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, around this issue of the investigations into child sex abuse rings. Again, a lot of the media stories were about that attack and about the back and forth between Musk and Starmer and politicians in the UK, and the circus. And very few people were reporting on, well, what are Musk's real motives here? How do you explain this behavior? There are those stories, but they're hidden below all of the noise. So I think focusing more on those kinds of stories is important. Um, and as I said before, I also think that writing about what could be ways to bring about change, what could be things that might short circuit these power grabs, what citizens can do. I think that's a way to once again make people feel less disempowered and helpless, and more feel like they have some sort of agency, rather than the feeling I think we all currently have is that we, society, are basically the playthings of millionaires.
Hmm. So to jump into topics, I know we have a deadline, so I want to respect your time. How do you think that journalists and also independent creators should use
Mm.
AI, and how do you think AI will impact their work now and in the next couple of years?
Yeah. I think there are a lot of ways in which we could be using it, and a lot of ways in which we will be, and some of those ways we don't even know yet. Um, Let me just take some examples. I don't think this is going to be a comprehensive answer. I think AI is beginning to prove useful and will prove useful in investigative journalism, particularly because investigative journalism relies more and more on making sense of huge amounts of data. And you have data journalists who can take a data set, if it's reasonably well structured, set of numbers, clean it up, do analyses on it, figure out trends or figure out outliers, or find the stories in it, or use it to prove a trend that is happening. Um, but a lot of the information that we need to be researching, that exists out there in the world, is not well structured. It's in PDF documents. It's on web pages of different kinds. It's in differing data formats. And large language models, generative AI, the kinds of stuff that we're using now, is actually not bad at figuring out how to make sense of data that is spread across these very messy, different, unstructured formats. And I think we will see people getting better at figuring out how to use the tools for that. And so it creates new opportunities for investigative journalism. A second way in which I think we can use it is that, and I think this is actually really important for the future of media everywhere. I think media need to get better at communicating with their communities, with their audiences, to understand what their actual needs are. I think one of the reasons for this falling trust in media is the sense that the media is reporting on stories that are somewhat abstract or somewhat removed from you as a reader, or they're caught up in the political horse race, but they're not actually answering the questions that you have. And those questions that readers have might sometimes be very prosaic ones. How do I proof my home against fire if I live in a zone that is susceptible to wildfires? Or how do I find a good school for my kids? Or how do I buy a secondhand car without being ripped off? And I think that there are tools now that media organizations can use to communicate with a large number of their audience. Before, when we had social media, media organizations were trying to say, okay, write to us on email or tweet at us on Twitter, but they didn't have a good way of handling that just volume of input. AI models are a way to synthesize ideas or synthesize themes across a very large number of input comments. They can provide a kind of chatbot interface that would allow you to directly speak to your media organization in a way, ask it questions, ask questions based on the archive that the media organization has reported. Tell me about the trends that have led to this story, or what's behind this news story that you published. So I think AI provides new ways, new interfaces, and ways for readers to interact with media organizations and build a relationship and build trust. Um, I think those are kind of two of the most important ways in which I think we'll see journalists using AI. A lot of the things that people are trying right now are suggest a headline for this story, or write me a summary of the story that I can put as bullet points at the top. Those things may be helpful, but I think they make a marginal difference. I think the AI for community engagement in particular is where you could see a much bigger opportunity for media organizations to build that connection with their audiences.
That makes a lot of sense. And it also makes me think about, information overload, how much
Mm.
information there is out there on the internet, and how hard it can be actually to find something that is useful sometimes. I
Yeah.
can even compare it to like Netflix. When you
Mm.
want to find a movie or a series, there's like a
Mm.
million options, but still it can be very hard to find something you want to see. Perhaps
Yes.
like that's where AI could help as well.
And I think this is a kind of, this is where it comes down a little bit to the question of, is AI accurate enough? to give you that information. And I think there's a bit of a trade-off. If you try to use Google search now to find something out, I think it increasingly feels to people like it's not very useful. You're served so many web pages that are low quality, that have gamed the system to rise up high in the search results, but are not actually delivering useful information, or they're all copying each other. And it can be really hard to get to the bottom of a question. You put an AI on the question and it scans the web and it extracts things from stories. It may get some things wrong. It makes some mistakes. It can, particularly, I think it can get some basic facts very wrong, and that's a problem. But you may still end up with a better answer than if you had just, and certainly a faster answer than if you had spent half an hour going through a whole bunch of web pages. Um, and so I think there is potential for these models to get better at weeding out the mistakes and helping people be better informed. Of course, there's a problem related to that, which media organizations are now starting to experience, which is in the past, if you searched for a question on Google, it would give you a list of links. Some of those links pointed to stories on newspapers. You would go to those newspapers' websites. They would get readers. They would get audience. That's how they make their money. If you now go to a Google search, or you go into ChatGPT or one of these other bots and you ask it a question, and it synthesizes an answer for you, you don't need to go to those original sources. You don't go to those links. The news publications lose traffic. And so that creates a kind of a bit of an existential problem. How do these news outlets now make a living? What's their business model? Some of them are in negotiations with the AI companies to license their content. I don't think those licensing deals will be enough to make the news businesses sustainable. So that's a problem that isn't yet solved. And I think that is like one of the risks of AI as it relates to news. But as I said, I think there is opportunity for AI to help make people better informed. And whether or not whether it does, or whether it ends up being used to once again satisfy people's existing biases, depends a little bit on how the AI models are built. So I think you can see both an optimistic and a pessimistic outcome here.
Cool. And towards the end here,
Yeah.
what can people expect from Futurepolis this year?
I'm going to try to write about a broad array of things that I see as interesting in the future of democracy. I want to give people a sense that we're not stuck with these old institutions, that there is innovation happening, there is hope, and there's potential. I think that I originally started this with the idea of being very international. I think inevitably, because Trump won, I am going to end up focusing more on America. That's my
Mm.
suspicion. Although I want to still write about good examples of interesting innovation that are happening overseas, because I think those can be pointers to what could be done better in America. I think I will be focusing a lot on what's happening at the local level. I think that, with Trump in power, we're not going to see much improvement in democratic institutions at the federal level. Indeed, things are going to get worse. Institutions are going to get dismantled. Election integrity is going to be weakened. Things are going to go backwards. But I think partly because America is a federal system, there is actually quite a lot of scope for things to work differently at the local level and the state level. And I think some of the most interesting experiments in the participatory democracy that I talked about, for instance, or in making government services work better, a lot of the most interesting work there is happening at local level, in municipalities, within states. And so I will be trying to focus on what those things that are happening are, because I think those point to sources for optimism. They point to what the future could look like. And so the more that you look at those different examples in different places and highlight them, I think the more you might create a sense of possibility for what a better form of governance could be.
Amazing. I think that's all we have time for. But thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.